Let me just introduce Dr. Rolf Alter. He's the Senior Fellow at the Hertie School of Governance. He will be the moderator for today's discussion, and he's going to introduce our speaker. Rolf was previously the Director of Public Governance at the OECD in Paris. He's also worked at the IMF and in the German government. He has his doctoral degree from the University of Göttingen in Germany. So over to you, Rolf.
Thank you very much, Todd, and very welcome to this very important and very timely seminar on sovereignty. Sovereignty, in a very sort of straightforward definition, is the power to set rules. And how important rules are, no doubt, I think we all know that. Rules that were set after the Second World War have been very, very positive in their impact on the way economies worked, certainly politics worked, and I'd say also societies by and large did well. Those rules in the economic sphere particularly relevant when managed by IMF, the World Bank, OECD, WTO, and so on. We saw that that's a value that facilitates business, reduces costs, and therefore could be certainly a very important instrument for having prosperity and with that well-being, I hope, for everybody. Jeremy Shapiro, who is our guest today, he's a research director with the European Council on Foreign Relations, and his colleagues, quite a few of them, have taken a really deep dive in an issue that concerns, in particular, Europe. And the question, if I may summarize, was simply, if sovereignty in Europe is under threat, what does it take to get back to the role of at least co-shaping these rules of the game? Recently, for the last 2 or 3 years, we have seen that there is a real issue there. And I thought it was wonderful to have this seminar now, because I think it follows nicely from a seminar that the World Trade Association carried out recently about navigating the risks. And that's probably what will we come down to. How do we manage these current difficulties that seem to show up? So very simply, I would ask Jeremy the first question, and I hope that we have a bit of a discussion as well. Jeremy, why the European Council really took that deep dive in the question of sovereignty and building a strategy around it for Europe? Please.
Yeah, that's a good place to start, actually. I mean, of course, the simple answer is that that's the question a lot of European governments were asking us. What are the threats to our sovereignty and how can we protect them? And we started, as you sort of implied, from the idea that European countries have become increasingly vulnerable to external pressure, and that prevents them from exercising their sovereignty, essentially from having the capacity to act independently. And as you mentioned, that this vulnerability really does in the long term threaten European Union member states' security, their economic health, their diplomatic freedom of action, and essentially allows other powers to impose their preferences on European Union member states. And so that was obviously of great concern to European Union governments. And they've been, if you've been following the debate in Europe, you'll see that they've been asking that question of themselves, and they're asking it of think tanks like ours. And so we actually did this project in cooperation with the European External Action Service and 8 different EU member states. And we started from the notion that if European states really want to prosper and to maintain their independence in a world of what we're clearly seeing as increasing geopolitical competition, that they have to address the interlinked security and economic challenges other powerful states present. And they have to do that in a geopolitical manner, but also, of course, without giving up on their values, without withdrawing their support for rules-based order or free trade or the Atlantic Alliance. And so what we tried to fashion to think about this is a new idea of strategic sovereignty that European Union's member states could stake up. And I think it's worth pausing to think a little bit about what we mean by that. I think sovereignty obviously is a term that has a lot of freight associated with it. And oftentimes, particularly in a European context, it's associated with the effort of European Union member states to sort of maintain their independence vis-a-vis Brussels, national sovereignty. That's not exactly what we're talking about here. We're sort of returning to an idea that Alan Milward put forward in the early 90s, which is this idea that the European Union actually enables and protects the sovereignty of its member states by enabling them together to preserve their independence in a way that no individual state in a sort of world of much larger states would be able to do. So this is what Milward called the European rescue of the nation state. And I think if you look at the history of the European Union in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, you see that they were able, on a host of different, particularly economic issues, they were able to do this. They were able to, by banding together through the mechanism of the European Union, actually get better trade deals, get better regulatory results vis-a-vis third parties by working together through this mechanism. Now, I think, there's an open question in Europe today, more so than there was, say, 10 years ago, about really whether European Union member states want to pool this sovereignty and whether they want such unity. I don't think it's for us to prejudge that necessarily. There's certainly different answers to that in Brussels versus in Budapest. But I would note that given that, as a former European Commission president used to put it, the European Union has two kinds of states, the kind that know they're small and the kind that don't. Their choices are either to participate in a process in Brussels that gives them co-decision on such issues, or to let those things be decided in places like Moscow and Beijing or Washington without their participation. And that's what we mean by strategic sovereignty, is the ability for European Union member states to working together to be able to preserve on geopolitical issues their ability to act together and to preserve their independence vis-a-vis some of these other states. So how do you achieve that? That was, of course, a more difficult question.
Jeremy, thank you very much. And so if I understand correctly, it is not just an issue of most recent developments. You're really putting it in a historical context, that question of sovereignty has been with member states of the European Union, and therefore, of course, also with the European Union itself. And if I may ask you, these more recent events, if you take the trade war, if you want to call it that way, these decisions that definitely show that there are two big rivals out there that have something to do with each other. But there's also a few other events that you mentioned in your research that have shown that these rules and these ideas about separating geopolitical sovereignty from the economic perspective is no longer valid, actually. Would you agree that these are the questions that have been sort of highlighted in these recent 2 years or 3 years, maybe?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if there was one single sort of overarching conclusion from our study, it would be that it is no longer possible to separate out geopolitical and what we call geoeconomic tools and to hope to be able to achieve the sort of independent outcomes that you want. And I mean, I can give a pretty good example of that, because I think one of the things that really that really spurred this study for a lot of the EU states was the argument with the United States over the question of the Iran nuclear deal, which after all is a sort of geopolitical issue of the first eminence. And essentially from a standpoint of EU foreign policy, the Iran nuclear deal was their single greatest achievement in the last decade or more. What they had proven to themselves, and I think to the United States in the course of negotiating that deal, was that if the European Union was unified, if the European Union knew what it wanted, that it could actually move the United States, it could move Russia, it could exercise enough power, enough capacity to get an outcome that it preferred. And so I think it justifiably took a lot of pride in that deal. Of course, in the United States, we thought it was down to us, but that's of course the genius of diplomacy, is everybody thinks they were responsible. When Donald Trump chose to withdraw from that deal in, I guess it was 2018, 2017, excuse me. What he essentially said was, we're getting out. European Union banks and companies can no longer do business with Iran. And of course, the European governments were like, well, no, we are still into this deal. We negotiated this deal. We're very proud of it. We think you're wrong to leave it. And so we think that those requirements shouldn't come back onto European corporations and banks. But in fact, immediately, more or less immediately, all of the European Union banks and member states started abiding by the US view, not the European view. And the US was able to make their Iran policy very, very effective, in contradiction to what the expressed view of the consensus, the majority, all of the European Union member states. So how were they able to do that? Well, actually, we go through that in great detail, but I think probably this audience understands it better than most. It comes down to the centrality of the US in the global financial system and the centrality of the US dollar in the global financial system. And what that means is that the US has long had this capacity, but was sort of abiding by gentleman's rules for the most part not to use it. And by the way, this capacity has interestingly increased in the last decade or two. But what's the bigger difference, I think, is that now the United States, living in a more geopolitical age, is really willing to use this tool even against the EU. And that has meant that because the US has achieved the sort of integration of its geoeconomic capacity, its ability to use its currency and financial system advantage to promote its geopolitical goals, the EU has lost a lot of independent capacity to act, and they probably need to do something about that.
From a European perspective, you said you had quite a number of governments that have asked you to think about it and to look for solutions. Why do you think that it took so long to discover that this was in the coming, that this loss, if there ever was really sovereignty, but that increasing loss to play a role in setting rules or maintaining them, enforcing them? Why would it take so long that only now, when we are pretty advanced, they call on you and you have to come with a few solutions, or at least proposals for solutions? And we get there in a minute, but I would like to hear your views on how Europe was so slow.
Yeah, well, look, I think that for much of the post-Cold War period, Europeans didn't really realize, they didn't confront the fact that they didn't have this capacity. And I think it's because they had constructed the EU to be embedded in a global order, which was essentially run by US power, which the US sort of undergirded. and which allowed them to have a sort of independent economic policy on issues like trade without really getting interfered with by the geopolitical elements, because the US was sort of, even during the Cold War and in the post-Cold War period, the US was essentially protecting them from those elements, even though that wasn't obvious and they didn't really feel that way. And I think that in the last 10 years or so, particularly since the financial crisis, it's become very clear that, that the US had long been playing this role, that the US was increasingly less willing to play this role, and that as geopolitical competition heated up between the US and China primarily, but generally speaking, that the European Union was going to be increasingly exposed. And this created a huge, it remains a huge problem for the EU, because the EU is not, it's not just that they didn't realize this, is that the EU was constructed for this previous world, which means that it's not just that they don't integrate geoeconomic and geopolitical tools, it's that they are structurally separate. A lot of the economic tools have been pushed up to Brussels, things like trade, competition policy, but the geopolitical tools largely remain with the member states, things like military capacity and sanctions policy. And so they have a structural problem that that more unified nation states don't have in integrating this. I should point out, it's a challenge for everybody, but it's a particular challenge for the EU.
You see, when you look at the comparison, I mean, very rough, but nevertheless, if you see that the European Union is a much more open, trade open unit of countries. If you take from a Berlin perspective, it's 47% of GDP is exports. So there would have been a very important reason to stick to it if you compare this to the US, which is about 12% of GDP for exports, means the interest should have been actually the other way around. Preserving really the rules was, and still is, very much in the interest of an open set of countries in comparison to one that's also open, but which says simply the fact is they are not so much, the US are exposed to the fluctuations on the world market.
Yeah, I think that that's right. The fact that the US was willing to do this was always a bit anomalous. It didn't really follow, strictly speaking, at least from a short-term perspective, their interest. And it resulted from the fact that, principally from the Cold War competition and a realization among American statesmen in the 40s and 50s that a strong, prosperous Europe was fundamentally in the US interest in the competition with the Soviet Union, and that it made sense to take some sort of short-term sacrifices from a US perspective to encourage that kind of movement, which is, of course, the logic that allowed led the US to allow the creation, and more than allow, encourage the creation of the European Union. And I think it's, that lasted all the way through the post-Cold War period, but I think now as geopolitical competition is heating up with China and also with Russia, that isn't so obvious anymore to US statesmen. And I think that they're much more inclined to take the sort of short-term geopolitical advantages vis-a-vis Europe or anywhere else, and are much less interested in maintaining the entire system in the interests of a bipolar competition.
In your really elaborate work, you have paid particular attention also to this issue of economic sovereignty. Mm-hmm. And you have made a pretty, well, I would say a pretty sober analysis of what is today insufficiently organized and how it should be organized in the future. So my question here is, could you just, from an economic point of view, list a few of those deficiencies that you see today in the European Union?
Well, I mean, as I mentioned, the principal deficiency that we see is the lack of institutional capacity to integrate geoeconomic and geopolitical tools, to be able to use, say, the position of the way that the U.S. did, to use the position of the dollar to be able to realize the goal in Iran. So we were thinking about, you know, how would Europe be able to use things like trade, development, the use of the euro, technology policy, competition policy, state aid policy, in the service of geopolitical goals, or at least to protect themselves from other people's geopolitical goals. And I think we have there's a sort of series of 6 papers, which I blessedly won't take your audience through. We come up with 56 specific recommendations on issues like AI, like international economic policy, secondary sanctions, multilateralism, and defense, and hybrid threats. But on a more global perspective, what we also do is sort of, in addition to the sort of policy recommendations, we tried to step back and say, okay, well, how would you actually design a system in Brussels and across the national capitals that was institutionally capable of doing this, so that broke down a lot of the silos so that they could implement the recommendations, the 56 recommendations that we put forward. And I think there's a few specific recommendations in there about creating what we call strategic sovereignty agendas and committees. But the fundamental point is that you have to create officials and institutions who have both the knowledge and the institutional incentives to do this. And I think that that's really underestimated. Currently, nobody in Brussels and in most of the national capitals is really responsible for this. There's a trade guy who's responsible for increasing trade. There's a security guy who's responsible for making sure that security works. And those guys, you know, yeah, they probably meet at parties, but they actually don't have a way that they are judged together. Only the head of state actually brings together all of these things. And as you go down into the chains in Brussels or in any of the other capitals, you'll find that there is nobody whose job it is to do this. And so and actually very few people even understand, have both the economic and the geopolitical knowledge to understand how to do it. And so what we're thinking about creating is institutions which, first of all, are judged according to this perspective, and which will foster people who are both capable of it and have a career incentive to do it. So there's a lot of stuff about staff in there. I would say that, you know, I think you can be rightly criticized at times for, when you're doing this kind of thing, for just sort of reorganizing boxes around Brussels. We did that a little bit, but I think what's really important to us is that it sits on top of 56 different recommendations. And so the point is that these are the kinds of institutional changes you need in order to be able to implement those things.
When you think about the institutional setups, of course today institutions play a critical role, but as we also know, there is a certain distrust between institutions and citizens who think about their governments. And certainly that's also the case vis-a-vis Brussels. When you think about that relationship, will it be sufficient to create the mechanisms in Brussels, in the Commission, to really get this agenda going, perhaps from a policy point of view, from a technical point of view, but where will the other stakeholders come in? And Jeremy, if I think it fits very nicely. One of our in the audience, Christina, she asked the question, and I think that fits really here well. How do you explain such a greater role for Brussels to the citizens of a few of the countries that are not very eager to give up their national government's prerogative, if I may call it that way?
Yeah, sure. That is the sort of essential question. I was hoping the questions would be a little easier. But sometimes I sort of think that that at ECFR we can't do everything, and that's sort of the politician's job. But I think it's absolutely the right question to ask. I think obviously this is something which it's not clear that all member states want remotely. I hope I was clear when I was talking that the reforms that we're talking about are not just in Brussels. They're not even maybe primarily in Brussels. This is something, in terms of this integration of the political and the economic, it really does have to happen in the national capitals as well. And there has to be connections between them. But I don't think that obviates the question. Our fundamental point here is that this answers a problem that European Union states have, that they know that they have. They are not able to operate independently, and when they're facing up individually with countries like China or Russia or the United States, they recognize quite clearly that they need help. Now, Brussels, for some of them, not most of them, but for some of them, Brussels is a similar problem. They feel as if they are losing sovereignty not only to Moscow and Beijing, but to Brussels. Some of them feel that they're losing sovereignty even more so. Our point is, first of all, that Brussels can be a problem for specific member states, but that is a place where European Union states get to participate and co-decide, in which there are very formal procedures for doing that, which more or less work. Moscow and Beijing and Washington are not places where European Union member states can do that. And in fact, those are fundamentally and increasingly diktats. But I think the other point is that there's a real onus on the European Union itself. I think in a way that it hasn't really always answered the mail. This is, the European Union has to see itself in this regard as a service provider to its member states. I mean, obviously its member states want different things, so there's a trade-off there. But it has to be answering the questions that the member states are asking. It has to be, I mean, as I pointed out, 8 member states came to us about this problem. So they realize that they have a problem. The European Union can't be simply deciding that it wants to, negotiate trade arrangements because that's what it does, and not really that interested in whether the member states want it or not. No, it has to be, and this is implicit in a lot of the institutional design that we created. The European Union has to be providing for its member states. It has to be seen as, and in fact protecting their sovereignty against outside powers, doing what Millward said it had done in the 60s and 70s and 80s, which is enhancing their ability to act independently. And I think it has lots of possibilities to do that. It does that at times, but not enough, and not consciously enough, and not avowedly enough. And so I do think that it has a job to do. I don't think, frankly, it should be working at the level of citizens. That's just not, I don't think it's politically able to do that. That's frankly a local politician's job, and I don't really see, from my experience, that, let's say, European Union Commission presidents are good at doing that in countries that aren't their own. Sometimes they're not even good in their own. So what I think they need to be doing is making sure that they are providing for their member states.
From another perspective, Jeremy, sovereignty has sometimes this connotation as well, as this is a sort of, or at least there's a risk, and I think in your work you really address that question explicitly. This is not about protectionism, and it is not about a retreat from globalization, and you make that point. But I think it would be worthwhile to have your comments now in this setup, because that is certainly a critical issue as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a real challenge. I mean, it's sort of easy to say. What we tried to do, particularly in the economic sovereignty chapter, is to note that that it's very easy when you're designing geoeconomic policies to protect geopolitical goals for them to be captured by special interests. It's easy for an industrial policy which is intended to protect domestic innovation to evolve into a policy which is essentially protecting senescent industries. And so you really do need, and that's clearly not particularly in the interests of the EU, but actually not really in the interests of anyone. And when I look at a lot of the policies of the Trump administration, but also of China and Russia and a bunch of other states, I see that they're really that they're sort of throwing out the baby with the bathwater a lot. That they are in an effort to regain independence and control over their geopolitical destinies. They are sacrificing a lot of their capacity for future growth and innovation by what's come to be called decoupling, deglobalization, by forming blocks. I mean, you know, we've been through the 1930s. We know what this looks like, and we know it's not really beneficial to anyone. And I think that the European Union has to be, is in some ways the most vulnerable to this, because as you pointed out, it has the most to lose. It's the most open economy, and it benefits from this stuff arguably the most. And also that it has a history of this type of protection in various of its states, which is problematic. So what we were looking to do when we developed this core, and when we developed the capacity to integrate economic tools into geopolitical goals, is to provide protections so that it doesn't devolve into protectionism. And I think that will be, there's no question that will be a continual struggle. I think it's sort of the history of the EU, of all of the democracies for quite some time, and there's no question it will continue. But I think it's possible to reduce that likelihood through the sort of institutional design.
Jeremy, we wanted to make sure that there are also some of the people in the audience have a chance to ask their questions to you. Some of it I see, but maybe there are others that would like to come in. And while that's going on, I just wanted to see how you think, or what could be the role of private sector, maybe in its form of their interest groups, their associations, to maybe even pressure for this drive towards sovereignty, or at least make sure that the evidence that you were talking about, which is so important, would become available and would be made available also in a relatively structured way to those debates that, for example, your suggestions of these committees in Brussels would benefit from.
Yeah, well, I think the first point to make is that the European private sector has a really critical interest in making sure that that both the EU and maybe more importantly its home state government is capable of this. Because what we're seeing as the geopolitical competition heats up is that there's an increasing sort of home bias in regulation and in the way that, and particularly in innovation policy, where governments around the world are increasingly trying to capture the fruits of future innovation for their home economies. You know, obviously this has been going on for quite some time, but I think it's dramatically increasing as this becomes not just an economic issue, but also a sort of issue of power. And so people are quite worried about the power capacities that will come from new technologies. And so they're increasingly husbanding them or stealing them from others. And that means that each government is going to be more and more actively promoting its own companies to be able to do this, and protecting its own companies from being able to do this. And if the European Union governments aren't capable of doing this, they're going to be at a big disadvantage. Now, particularly from an EU standpoint, that's a second best outcome. You would rather that nobody did this. And so ultimately, I think the goal is, that the best defense is the best offense is a good defense. And what you want to be able to do is demonstrate that that you're capable of doing this in order to create the process of a negotiation, so that, and I think the companies should be quite supportive of that, that will allow for a more open trading and technological system, because that will, in the end, first of all, also reduce geopolitical competition, which is good for everybody. But I think actually it's also the principal route to prosperity and to companies, certainly in Europe, but well beyond, being able to prosper on international markets. And it's not the way we're heading right now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Jeremy, I think those among in the audience that are close to business, I think they can see here there is some call for action on their side as well. I got an interesting question from Constance. She said, in all of this, we haven't spoken about NATO. And in fact, after all, NATO was also an important arm of the rules and regulations, if you like, in the post-war period. So how do you position NATO in this debate?
Yeah, no, I think NATO is really important, and it's something that we covered a lot in the study. I think it's really important. I mentioned about protectionism, that you not throw baby out with the bathwater. I think the Transatlantic Alliance falls in the same category. From my perspective as an American who lives in Europe, the Transatlantic Alliance is very effective for both sides. And I think it's been threatened by the types of recent developments that I've talked about. But I think therefore it needs to adjust to a more geopolitical world and to a more balanced relationship between the US and Europe, but that it should still be able to survive and provide value for both sides. And I think particularly when you look at preserving that relationship while creating within Europe a more independent capacity to defend itself, which is something that the United States is asking for, to be able to spend more money, but also maintaining the link. What we really think is important is, yes, developing European defense capabilities in the way that that the EU has sort of embarked upon in the last 2 or 3 years through PESCO and through the European Intervention Initiative. But I think, the European Union capabilities are not really separate from NATO capabilities. Both of these defense organizations are actually just the sum of their member states. And so what we want to do is use also NATO to help develop capabilities that can give Europe the confidence to be able to operate alone, but also maintain the capacity to operate with the United States when it's advantageous to do so. And so what that really entails, I think, is creating within NATO, what's something that's been talked about for many years, a European pillar, which will both allow Europeans to develop capabilities that will be useful in a transatlantic context, but also will allow them, in a way that they aren't really able to do today, to operate in many specific ways without the United States, so that they can protect themselves geopolitically. And I think that that's a way of trying to be advantageous to both sides.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you very much for your brilliant explanations. I'm sure that you advocate a mindset change that has to occur. I think these 3/4 of an hour should have encouraged it. And as we see, there is a new commission in the EU that will certainly listen to you. There's maybe also a new president in the US. The only continuity will be in China.
That's a little bit less certain, but we'll see.
Yes. Thank you very, very much. And I'll pass on to Todd.
Thank you.
Excellent. Rolf, Jeremy, thank you both so much for your time. Jeremy, especially the research that you and the entire group at the ECFR is doing. I'd encourage people to look through your website. There's sign up for your newsletter. I enjoy reading it every week. Thanks everybody for joining us today to be part of this webinar. We're really happy that the EACC is able to make this available. Please give us your feedback through your local EACC chapter on your on today's webinar. Stay tuned for further events as they are programmed. Let us know if you have ideas for future topics for webinars. And just so you know, a recording of this event will be sent shortly to everyone who registered. So you'll have a record of that for your file. So again, Jeremy, Rolf, thank you so much for joining us today, for your insights, and we'll hope to see everybody in the near future. All the best.
Thank you.